My name is David Ulevitch, and I am the founder and CEO of OpenDNS. We are an internet-wide security network that provides protection to everyone from individuals at home and parents and kids, all the way to some of the largest businesses in the world, from internet threats like malware, phishing, and botnet attacks. So, when thinking about how to build a secure product or when to think about security, I've always been a big believer that security has to be baked in. It can't be bolted on later. You have to have a mindset of security, which means that if you don't have anybody who you would think inside your company is security aware or is knowledgeable in security best practices, you need to bring that talent in, or you need to hire a firm to help you integrate those kind of best practices directly from the beginning. Meaning, if you're not, hashing your passwords and salting them, and things like we've read a lot recently about lots of password leaks, whether it's from LinkedIn, Yahoo just had a big password leak. And when you have those kinds of leaks, they lose all the trust in your company. So not only is it bad from a security standpoint, but it's terrible from a brand management standpoint. And security is not that hard. So I guess one thing I would say is that security is not that hard. It doesn't add extra time. It's just about doing things right the first time around. And you need to bake it in from the very beginning. You need to have security best practices. You need to know that when you're using things like EC2, there are security best practices guides out there, and you can't just say, oh, we'll get to it later, or we'll do it later, because I promise you, when you get to it later, it will be already too late. You'll be scrambling to cover up for some big disaster. On the one hand, we're seeing the complete disregard of most security best practices. People are lowering their firewalls. They're making things more accessible so that you can use your iPhone to check corporate email or store files in the cloud. DLP solutions, which are supposed to prevent you from leaking sensitive data from your enterprise, are often being disregarded or circumvented. So you may have this complex security appliance inside your network, but when your workers out in the field, they're at SFO, they're on the Wi-Fi, and they're using Google Apps for email, they're using Dropbox for their file storage, they're using Salesforce in the cloud, then your data loss prevention appliance that you just paid $500,000 for isn't going to do anything because nobody's ever connecting back to your headquarters. So we're seeing the complete disregard for all the security best practices that we sort of set up over the last 20 years, while we're simultaneously seeing a massive acceleration of security threats. So for the first time ever, we're seeing what would appear to be bona fide state-sponsored security attacks. We're seeing companies be targeted, whether it was Google with the Aurora attacks that really compromised their network in China, or companies in the United States that are having their source code repositories be compromised for years, going undetected, and now being revealed to be state-sponsored attacks. So, when you combine the desire for people to have access to information, being able to use cloud applications and cloud services, and then you combine that with the fact that the threats are getting worse and they're getting more severe, that attacks are much more financially motivated, or they're motivated by state-sponsored attacks, those two things will eventually come to a head. And there'll be, I hate to imagine that, security is generally not the kind of space where there's whiplash effects or days of reckoning. Those things don't happen. I'm not a believer that there's going to be a day that the internet goes dark. But I do think that there'll be serious consequences, right? People's notions of privacy are changing, and what they share online is changing, but eventually they're going to come to a point where they realize that they've put out so much information, or companies have lowered their guard to such a degree that it'll be difficult to reestablish those barriers. What should companies be concerned about when it comes to security? And it's still one of the oldest threats, and it still remains one of the most effective, which is social engineering. How do you get somebody to do something that will benefit you? And companies are often seeing that you can call up, access often gets disseminated at various degrees inside of a company. And so if your customer support rep has the ability to change somebody's account permissions, or has the ability to accept attachments from a customer, and then open those attachments inside the corporate network, people are seeing more often that those vectors are being abused to get a foothold inside of networks. So an example would be when RSA was recently compromised. It was because Excel documents that had malware embedded in them were sent to customer support representatives inside of RSA that were then opened, exploited, and from there, the bad guys were able to then exploit other parts of the RSA network. And so social engineering is a very difficult threat to combat. So you have to train people not to open attachments from untrusted sources, but there's also security tools you can use. You can sandbox software and things of that sort, but those things are very, very difficult to prevent against. More often than not, security practitioners and IT professionals, they get distracted by a lot of noise. And so the goal in security is, how do you eliminate the noise and focus on what really matters, and how do you advance the state of the art or advance the objectives of your company. And so I think that one thing that's easier today than it ever has been, if you're willing to put them in place, is to raise the bar for security. And there's a way to do that without trading off user experience and user performance. Generally, security has been deployed where the concerns of the user have always been disregarded. But one of the nice things about mobility and the fact that people are bringing their own devices around is that security vendors have to take into consideration what the user experience will be. Because if it's poor, users will just route around it. They'll forward everything to a Gmail account. They'll use Dropbox. They'll use all these services that make their ability to do their work easier. But I think there is a way to raise the bar for security without having to sacrifice the ability to use those services.